So we have this first example, we are going to be finding the distance between the footpath and the rock. So we're looking for the value of x, so this side right here. In order to do that, we have to look at what we are given. So we are given the value of this angle over here. So this angle is 19. What is side x in relation to this angle? Would it be adjacent, opposite, hypotenuse?
Opposite.
All right, it would be opposite because it's directly opposite the angle. It's what the angle is looking at. This side would be adjacent, even though that side isn't labeled. This side over here is my hypotenuse because it's my longest side directly across from the 90-degree angle. So looking at what they give us, they don't give us a value for adjacent. So I'm just going to kind of ignore that. But they do give us a value for the hypotenuse, and they give us x for opposite, and they give us this angle. So if I have opposite and hypotenuse, remember our little key for the trig functions, which one of these includes opposite and hypotenuse? Sine, cosine, or tangent? All right, sine, right? So if I take sine of an angle, and they do give us the value of the angle, that value is 19. So here, let me put it this way, actually. So we have sine of an angle equal to opposite over hypotenuse. That's the definition of sine. We do have the value of the angle. We have opposite listed as x in the picture, and then we have the hypotenuse labeled as 76. All right, since we have 2 out of the 3 pieces of information, we can now solve for x. All right, for this, you will want to get the x by itself. So do the opposite of what's being done. What's opposite of dividing by 76? Multiplying by 76. And what you do on one side, you have to do to the other side. So on the right side, the 76's will cancel. On the left side, this is what I have. I have 76 sine 19 equal to x. All right. You need to use a calculator to figure out what the left side is. All right, but you also need to make sure that your calculator is in degrees. All right, so put like a star here. Make sure calculator is set to degrees. And I'll show you how to do that. All right, because the other option would be radians, and that would give you a different measurement, which would just completely give you the wrong answer. So since we are using the TI-84s on the quizzes, we're going to practice using it with the TI-84. I know Desmos is a lot easier. I prefer that one, but I can still show you how to use the TI-84. It's really not that hard. All right, so everyone, if you don't have a TI-84 calculator in front of you, go grab one so that you can follow along. Grab one that works. Right, looking at your calculator, looking at all the buttons, you see where it says second. I'm over there. Yeah, just like on the back. Okay, go ahead. Sorry. All right. So on your calculator, look by the second button, the blue button right next to it. You'll see a mode button. All right, click that. It brings up a menu. And when you use the down arrow, you see like the options radian and degree. Put the arrow to degree and hit enter. All right, mine happens to already be on degrees. Maybe yours is, maybe yours isn't. All right, anyone having trouble finding it? All right, once you hit enter on the degree, you'll hit clear and it'll take you back to the calculator function. All right, so then just to kind of show you, you'll click the mode button, down arrow twice, so down arrow times 2, and then select degrees. And then hit enter. All right. Once you've done that, you're going to put this over here, what I'm about to highlight, in your calculator. All right, so you put in 76. There's a sign button on your calculator. The black button, kind of towards the middle, says SIN. And then you press 19, close the parenthesis, hit enter. If you did it right and your calculator is set to the right degree function, you should have x equal to about 24.74. All right, if you're getting something different, tell me so that I can make sure you have your calculator on the right setting. Okay. 76, sine 19. All right, anyone else not finding the button? All right, so to answer the question in the problem, the distance between the footpath and the rock is about 24.74 units, or yards. So it does actually give us a value. All right, questions, comments, concerns? All right, so that's the sine function to solve for missing parts of your triangle. So we're going to do the same thing with example 2. Sorry, did we need to stay on this page longer? All right, if you're writing on this page, write a little quicker. All right, so then on page 2, towards the top, example 2, we're solving for x in triangle MNO. Round the solution to the nearest hundredth. So kind of label your side, see what you're working with. What side is angle x referring to? Or not angle x, what is side x? Is it opposite, adjacent, or hypotenuse? The hypotenuse, good. So hypotenuse will be the same no matter what. It'll always be your longest side across from the 90-degree angle. The opposite and adjacent depends on what angle you are dealing with. So since it gives us this angle, we're going to deal with this angle. So side MN that is also labeled, would that be opposite or adjacent to this angle? Opposite, right? This side would be adjacent, but there's nothing over here, so I'm not really going to worry about that side. Opposite and hypotenuse goes with what function? For sine, so we're doing another sine problem. So sine functions are set up as sine x degrees equals opposite over hypotenuse. All right, it does give us an angle. So we're going to plug that in here. Don't confuse it with this x, all right? This is just like my standard trig function here. So sine of 66 degrees equals opposite, which is 17, over hypotenuse, which is x. All right, any questions how we set that up? All right, again, I knew what function to use because I looked at what it gave me. It gave me this side, it gave me this side, it didn't give me anything for adjacent. So that goes with sine, opposite over hypotenuse. All right, now let's see how well we remember algebra, because we need to solve for x now. This one, it's a little trickier. You can't just like divide or multiply 17, right? So what do I do instead to isolate the x first? All right, since order matters with division, I can't just say like times 17 because that wouldn't cancel it out. So what I'm actually going to have to multiply by to get this, to eventually solve for x, would be to multiply it by x. All right, I know it seems weird, just bear with me. All right, so if I multiply by x, that'll get rid of it on the right-hand side. And then what I do on one side, I have to do to the other side. So on the left side, I have x sine 66 equal to 17. Again, we want the x to be by itself. Right now it's being multiplied by this sine 66. So what's opposite of multiplying? So we're going to divide sine 66 on each side. All right, these kind of like stay together. Imagine that it's like parentheses right here. If there's something in front of it, it's being multiplied by it. All right, there may not always be parentheses there, just kind of imagine it that way. All right, because that'll isolate the x on the left side. So on the left side, I have x. On the right side, I need to put this into my calculator. So when you're putting it in your calculator, put some parentheses just to make sure the calculator reads it the correct way. So I would put 17 in parentheses divided by sine 66. It'll look something like that. All right, hopefully your calculator is already in degrees from you putting it there earlier. All right, and then if you entered it into the calculator the right way, then x should equal about, so that's what these squiggly lines mean because we're rounding, about 18.61 units. All right, this is my final answer. That's what this side equals. 18.61 units. All right, anyone not get that on their calculator? No, a different part of the calculator. All right, so then if there's no questions, we'll move on to the next one. So more practice with the sine function. All right, moving it on to the sine. All right, so there's also situations where you'll need to find a missing angle. All right, so now the missing value isn't on one of the sides, it's on the angle. So kind of highlight that. There's situations where you need to find the missing angle. In these situations, you'll use the inverse sine button. So you'll need to use the inverse sine button on your calculator, which looks like sine to the power of -1. All right. So to get that button or to get that function, you'll basically hit the second, that blue second button, and then you'll hit the sine button. And then on your calculator, you should see the sine to the -1. All right. So we're going to solve this triangle for the missing angle measure, and we're going to round it to the nearest hundredth after that. So first, let's label these sides. What is side PR? Is it adjacent to this angle measure? Is it the hypotenuse? Is it opposite that angle measure?
Hypotenuse.
All right, good, it's your hypotenuse. Because not only does it look to be your longest side, it's always, your hypotenuse is always directly across from your right angle. All right, so 47 is my hypotenuse. What is this side, QR, in relation to this angle that we're looking at?
Opposite.
Good, it's directly opposite. So again, another sine function, because sine is opposite over hypotenuse. All right, so since sine of x degrees equals opposite over hypotenuse, all right, we know that opposite is 26. We know the hypotenuse is 47, and that's how it's labeled. Now, since we're solving for x, we're trying to get this x by itself. In order to cancel out that sign, we're doing the inverse function. All right, so all that does is cancel out this sign that's right here. But then what you do to one side, you have to do to the other. So on the left side, I have x equals sine to the -1, 26 over 47. All right, so on the right is what you're entering into your calculator. All right, so don't shout out the answer, just kind of enter it and see if you get the same thing. So everyone practice entering it. You'll hit the second, the blue button, that's the second, and then you'll hit sine. And in the parentheses, you'll put 26 division sign, 47, close parentheses, enter. Second, you'll hit sine, yes? We have 5 minutes. You'll hit second, you'll hit sine. You'll do 26, division sign, 47, close parentheses, enter. All right, that's like a play-by-play for the button to use. All right, if you entered it the right way, here's what you should have gotten. You should have gotten that x is about 33.59 degrees, because it's an angle. All All right, anyone get something different? All right, and that's rounded to the hundredth, so 2 spots after the decimal. All right, so you have a couple you try problems on the next page. I'll just focus on the top 2, so problem 1 and 2. Once you have those answers, kind of call me over, I'll check it. I was gonna let you all go on break at 8:15 regardless, but if you get those 2 answers and they're right, I'll let you go like a couple minutes early. So just problem 1 and 2 for the U try on page 30. If you just enter sine 48 in your calculator and round it to the nearest thousand, so it should look like this, you get about 0.743. All right, questions on that? All right, the second one was making sure you knew how to solve for a missing piece using one of the trig ratios. On these notes, it's pretty easy to figure out which one we're using because there are titles. But I know like on your practice, it doesn't explicitly say like use sine or use cosine. All right, so you would just have to look at what you're given. So a ladder 13 feet long leans against the top of a structure at a 56-degree angle. What's the height of the building to the nearest hundredth of a foot? All right, so I would just look at what it gives me. Gives me an angle, gives me a value for what side would this be? That the 13 is on? Is it adjacent, hypotenuse, opposite? The hypotenuse, good. So across from the 90-degree angle will always be your hypotenuse. And then it doesn't give us a value for adjacent. There's nothing down here, but it gives us x for the opposite side, right? This is the side that's directly opposite the 56-degree angle. All right, questions on how and why we labeled it like this? So then when you look at your trig functions for which one you are going to use to solve for that missing piece, this x right here, we have opposite and hypotenuse. The only one that has both is this one. All right, so we're going to use this trig definition of sine x degrees equaling opposite over hypotenuse. All right, plug in the values that you are given. So we have sine of 56 degrees equals opposite, which is x, over hypotenuse, which is 13. All right, so that's how you should have set it up. Questions about that part? All right, so now it's just solving for x. So instead of dividing by 13, what can I do to get the x by itself? Would I add 13? Would I just subtract 13? Would I multiply by 13? Would I divide again by 13? All right, opposite would be to multiply. So multiply each side by 13. That'll get x by itself on the right side. On the left side, you have 13 times the sine of 56. Put that in your calculator, and you should have gotten, what was it, like 10.78? Yes, 10.78 feet. if you entered it in this way. All right, remember that sine, it's like sine of the angle. So the angle measure goes after the sine. Questions so far? So this is my final answer. All right, if you haven't done the next two U-Trig problems, do your minor paper now, I'll give you some time. And then there's another U-Trig problem at the top of page 4. All right, we'll do where it says cosine and all that together. Let's do the rest of page 3 and the top of page 4 in your notes. All right, so problem 3. You are having to use the inverse sine function in order to figure out what that x equals. All right, because sine x is always like sine, and then this would be like an angle measure. So anytime you need to find an angle measure, make sure you're using the sine inverse function. All right, so it should be sine to the -1, and then whatever they give you here, type that into your calculator. All right, so again, anytime you need to find an angle measure, use the inverse function. Angle measure, use inverse function. All right, so once you enter that in your calculator, you should have gotten that x is about 75 degrees. All right, if you got that on your first try, good job. If not, just maybe like star highlighted angle measures have the inverse function. Question? All right. Problem 4, solving for x rounding to the nearest hundredth. So to figure out what function we're using, just kind of see what they have labeled here. So we're looking at the perspective of the angle that's labeled. What is x representing? What side? All right, look for your 90-degree angle. Is it directly across from the 90-degree angle? Answer should be yes, so that would make it your hypotenuse. All right, so always across from the 90-degree angle is your hypotenuse. This 22, what side does that represent? Is it opposite or adjacent to angle K? Opposite, good. It's looking directly at it. It's not touching it, so that would make it opposite. Opposite and hypotenuse, the only function for that is sine. All right, so we're using the sine function. Here's the definition of the sine function again. And plug in what you're given. So sine of your angle measure, so sine 13, equals opposite, which is 22, over hypotenuse, which is x. All right, any confusion there? Now we're just solving for x. All right, if x is on the bottom though of the fraction, so your denominator, then you have to do like a little bit extra steps. You're gonna have to multiply each side by x first, because that'll get rid of it on the right-hand side. On the left side, I have x times the sine of 13 equal to 22. Now we can isolate the x. So it's kind of weird that we have to do that, but that's the rule since order matters with division. Alright, so multiply each side by x. Now you can start isolating it further. So what's opposite of multiplying? So we're going to divide each side by the sine of 13. Right? That's how we get the x by itself. So the x will be on the left. On the right, you're going to put this in your calculator. 22 divided by the sine of 13. All right, then just enter it all at once. All right, and if you put it in the right way, your calculator should have given you a number which makes x about 97.80 units. If we're rounding to decimal spots. All right, questions, comments? All right, if you got that on your first try, good job. Of confidence on you for the quiz. If not, just take really good notes, and then when you get to that problem on the quiz or practice, you'll be set. All right. So you had another U-try problem. I don't know if you got to it or not. If not, we'll just do it together. So the last U-try problem for right now was this one, problem 5, solving for x and rounding to the nearest hundred. Notice, is x an angle measure or a side length this time?
Angle.
It's an angle measure. So x is an angle measure. So what does that mean? What function are we using? So we're finding the missing angle. So basically what I'm asking is, am I gonna have it be sine or sine to the negative 1?
Sine.
All right, look back at problem 3. Anytime we're looking for an angle measure,
Or sine to the negative.
good. So since we're looking for an angle measure, just know we're going to use an inverse. All right, we're doing examples for sine right now, so that's why I put sine to the negative 1. But ordinarily, you have to label these sides to figure out what. Does that make sense? So the side KJ, what is that? Is that my hypotenuse? Is it adjacent? Is it opposite? All right, hypotenuse, because it's across the 90-degree angle. What's side LJ? Good, it's opposite to the angle that we're looking at. All right, it's opposite to angle F. Questions about that? All right, that's how I know I'm using the sine function, because opposite over hypotenuse. So here's the definition of the sine function. Plug in what you're given. So we don't know what the angle measure is, that's what we'll be solving. Opposite is the 42.7 hypotenuse, 56.3. And then again, because we are solving for the angle measure, it's going to be sine to the negative 1, 42.7 divided by 56.3. Questions, or did I go too fast, or does it make sense? All right, because doing the inverse sign on this side is what cancels out that sign. What you do to one side, you have to do to the other. That's what I have here. All right, so put what's on the right side in your calculator. Make sure it's the inverse sign, sine to the -1. So hit second, sine, put in that fraction. And if you did it the right way, you should have a number close to 49.33 degrees. All right, anyone get something different? Any questions? All right, so now we're going to look at cosine. So again, the practice doesn't tell you what function you're using like the notes does, so you're just going to have to follow along on how I help you figure that out. So on the next page, so we're looking at cosine now. We are going to determine the angle between the stream and the footpath. So this angle over here, is it? Let me see. All right, this might be labeled wrong. So in between the stream and the campsite. So we're gonna fix that. All right, because we're looking at angle Y, so Y degrees. All right, since we're looking at it from that angle, we need to label the two sides that it gives us. So it gives us these two measurements. What does the 50.5 yards, what side would that represent compared to the Y angle?
Adjacent.
Adjacent, good, because it's next to the angle. All right, the other side, the 69 yards, is also next to it, but that one is going to be called what? The hypotenuse, because the hypotenuse is always your longest side across from the 90 degree. Questions? All right, and then looking at our little cheat sheet, those words, which of these functions is the only one that has adjacent and hypotenuse?
Cosine.
All right, good. Cosine is the only one with adjacent and hypotenuse. So that is how we figured out that we're using cosine, because it won't always tell you. All right, so here's the function for cosine. We're going to plug in what we are given. The angle measure that we are given is Y degrees, so we don't actually know what that is right now. The adjacent side has a value of 50.5. The hypotenuse has a value of 69. And since we are looking for an angle measure, how will I enter this in the calculator? Do I put the cosine button or do I put the inverse cosine button?
Cosine.
Try again.
The second option.
All right, the second option, because we're looking for an angle measure. Anytime we're looking for an angle measure, you're going to have to use this function. All right, so it's going to be cosine to the -1, and then in parentheses that fraction. All right, that will give us the, what do you call it? The measurement of y. Questions about that? So we use that one because we're looking for the angle measure. All right, so practice doing this function on your calculator. It's kind of like the inverse sine function. You'll hit the blue second button, but this time you'll hit the cosine button after that, so that you see cosine to the -1 on your screen. You'll enter the fraction, and then close parenthesis, hit enter. All right, so practice putting that in your calculator. And when you do that, if you're getting something other than 42.96, then let me know. All right. So at practice entering it, and make sure you get the same number that I do. All right, questions, comments? Sorry, just giving a couple people a chance to write. We'll move on here in a few seconds. All right, so example 2, top of page 5. We are given this. It doesn't tell us that we're using cosine, even though we are in the cosine section. So just here's how we would figure out that we're using cosine. All right, look at the angle measure that you are given. All right, since that's the angle measure we're given, we're going to look at the triangle from that perspective and label the sides accordingly. So this side, US, what side is that going to be labeled as? Hypotenuse, good. It's your longest side across from the 90-degree angle. The side labeled X, so side TU, what's that one going to be labeled as compared to this angle? Adjacent. All right, because adjacent means next to. Good. Now that I have that, you go over your trig functions. The only one that has adjacent and hypotenuse at the same time is this one. So we're using this function rule, adjacent over hypotenuse, and plug in the values that you have. All right, do I have an angle measure? All right, can I plug something in for the angle? All right, yes, I can. It's given to us, so I'm going to put that in this spot. The angle measure will go for the x degrees. The adjacent side goes on top. That one is labeled as x, so I'm going to put that there. Hypotenuse goes on the bottom, and that one is labeled as 154. All right, now we're just solving for x. How can I get the x by itself? how do I get the x by itself? Multiply by 154. All right, that'll get rid of the denominator on the right side. And what you do on one side, you have to do to the other. All right, now that we have the x by itself, we can just enter everything into the calculator. So 154 cosine 28 equals x. All right, practice using your calculator, practice using the cosine function. All right, if you entered it the right way and you rounded to the nearest hundredth, you should have gotten 135.97 units. All right, questions? All right, I know it's getting repetitive, but we're trying to make you see patterns. So, you know, if this is like too easy, maybe you can speak up a little more and it'll go by faster. All right, so the next one, same setup. All right, we're still practicing with the cosine function. So on the next one. We are solving for x over here. We are given this angle measure, so we're going to label this from the perspective of this angle. What side will x represent? Hypotenuse, good. The other side that is labeled is my side TU adjacent. All right, I'm not really concerned with this other side, the opposite side, because it doesn't tell me anything there. So it's not going to be useful in helping me solve. All right, since I have adjacent and hypotenuse, I'm going to use cosine again. So cosine of x degrees is adjacent divided by hypotenuse, and plug in what you are given. All right, the angle measure that they gave you is 72. The adjacent side equals 15, and the hypotenuse equals x. All right, so setting it up according to the rule. Now we're just solving for x, or isolating the x. To get the x by itself, what do I have to do first? All right, can I just divide by 15 and call it a day? Could I multiply by 15? All right, if I multiply by 15, that won't cancel it out, right? So what I have to do instead is multiply by x. All right, I know it seems weird when we're trying to get x by itself, but it'll be easier to isolate if it's on the left side. All right, there's no easy way to isolate it on the right side right now. So on the right side, we cancel it out. Now we have x times the cosine of 72 equal to 15. All right, now what is opposite of multiplying? So I'm going to divide each side by the cosine of 72, because that will get the x by itself. So that'll cancel out. I have x equals 15 over cosine of 72. All right, put it all together in your calculator. Good. And it says hundredth, so I'll put to the hundredth, but that's still the same. All right, so rounded to the hundredth spot, so 2 spots after the decimal should be that x is about 48.54 units. All right, sorry, I know that was a little repetitive, but we're just trying to make you get used to it when x is in the denominator. All right, so page 6, you have 4 you-try problems. Page 7, you have another you-try problem. So take like 10 minutes. I think that's kind of a lot. Take a few minutes and work those out. Make sure you know how to do them for your quiz tomorrow. I'll come by, make sure we're on the right track. And then I'll just project the answers like once time is up. All right, because I think we're getting the hang of this. You can just see if you're doing it the right way. 63, you should have gotten 0.454. And it's rounded to the 1,000 spot, so that's 3 decimal places. All right, 0.454. Problem 2, so we have a real world situation going on that also gives us a picture. What you should have noticed is that the labeled angle down here, the sides that are labeled next to that angle would be your hypotenuse and your adjacent side. All right, since the opposite side isn't labeled, we're not really concerned with that side. So the only function that has adjacent and hypotenuse is cosine. All right, so plug that into your definition for cosine. The angle measure goes right after the COS part, cosine 61 degrees. Adjacent goes on top, that's labeled as 19. Hypotenuse, which is labeled as x, goes on the bottom. Right, and since we're solving for x, and x is in the denominator, the only way to eventually get it isolated is to multiply both sides by x. So that's what's shown here. Multiply both sides by x. We get x times cosine 61 equals 19. Keep going a little bit more to isolate it. So opposite of multiplying by cosine 61 would be to divide cosine 61. So that's what's down here. All right. Then you enter what's on the right side into your calculator. 19 divided by cosine of 61. And you get 39.19 feet for the hypotenuse. All right, questions about those first two? So problem 3, we have to solve for x. So they gave us this bit of information here. Because we're solving for an angle measure, we always use the inverse function. All right, so that's why it's cosine to the -1. That's our inverse function. Type in whatever they give you after that. And if you did that right, you should have gotten about 11 degrees. Really, it's 11.01 degrees. Questions? All right, problem 4. So again, we already know we're dealing with cosines because of the notes, that's what it says. But if you didn't know, we're just looking from the perspective of the angle that's labeled. So from this angle, we have the hypotenuse is 18, adjacent as x. Plug it into your cosine function and solve for x. All right, solving for x gives you x as 12.28. All right, questions on problem 4. All right, please speak up if you're not sure where a member came from. I'll be happy to tell you. All right, last you try that I had you do was this one. So notice we're solving for an angle measure again. So after plugging it into our function, x is still x. We don't know what the angle measure is. So that means we have to use our inverse function. All right, and using our inverse function gives us the angle measure of about 45.08 degrees. All right, questions, comments? All right, bear with me for about 9 more minutes, and I'll let you take another little break. All right, but for 9 more minutes, we are going to talk about tangent. All right, so now tangent. Again, the practice won't tell you what function to use like the note says. The quiz won't tell you what to use. You have to figure it out based on how this triangle is labeled. So look for the labeled angle measure. So this is the angle measure that's labeled, 43 degrees. And look at the sides that are labeled. So I have side Z, and then this other side that is 69 yards. So that's between the campsite and home, that angle. All right. We have to label those sides. So in relation to this angle that is labeled, what is side Z? Is it adjacent, opposite, hypotenuse?
Jason.
Good, it should be adjacent. All right, because it's next to that angle. All right, what is the 69 yards referring to? Is this my hypotenuse or the opposite?
Opposite.
Opposite, right? Hypotenuse would be over here, but they didn't label anything for that side, so we're not going to use that side to help us solve. Make sense? And then out of all the trig functions, which one is the only one that has opposite and adjacent?
Sine. I think.
No, it doesn't have the adjacent, so it's not going to be sine. It's going to be
Tangent.
good. All right, this one's the only one that has opposite and adjacent at the same time. So write down your function rule for tangent. It's tan x degrees equal to opposite over adjacent. All right, opposite over adjacent. All right, and then plug in what you're given. So it does give me the angle measure. So the angle measure is going to be 43. So it's going to be tan 43. It does give us the opposite side, so that's going to be 69. And it does give me the adjacent side, it's labeled Z. All right, now we're going to solve for the missing part, so solve for Z. Notice Z is in the denominator. So how do I move stuff around? What would I move around first? Can I move the 69 first? How would I move it? If I multiply each side by 69, I don't cancel it out on the right side, do I? So I'm not going to do that. That's one of those like special situations. The only easy way that I can move stuff around would be to move the Z to the other side. I know it seems counterintuitive, right? But it'll be a lot easier to isolate it if Z is on the other side. So that'll cancel out this fraction. On the left side, I have Z times tangent of 43 equals 69. All right, now I can get the Z by itself because I'll do the opposite of multiplying by the tangent. What's opposite of multiplying? So I'm going to divide each side by tangent of 43. On the left side, we have just Z. On the right side, we have this fraction that we can put into our calculator all at the same time. So 69 divided by tangent 43. And if you entered it the right way, I'll kind of hold off on yelling it out. So you guys hold off on yelling it out. All right, but once you plug that into your calculator, you should have had 73.99 yards. So 73.99 yards. It doesn't say what to round to, so I'll just leave it at that. All right, that's close to 74 yards. Questions? All right, just one more, then we'll go on break. So next page. We are given a triangle, doesn't tell us what function to use, but here's how we figure that out. Look for the angle that they labeled. So we're going to look from the perspective of angle I. What are these two other sides that are labeled in comparison to angle I? Are they opposite, hypotenuse, adjacent? So what's like side GH going to be?
Opposite.
Opposite, good. Directly across from the angle, so that's opposite side. The side labeled 23 will be what? It's either adjacent or hypotenuse. Which one makes more sense? Is this side my hypotenuse? Should be no. right? Because its hypotenuse is always across from the 90-degree angle. It doesn't touch the 90-degree angle. So that would mean that this side has to be my adjacent side. Make sense? So since I have opposite and adjacent, the trig function that I'm using is tangent, because that's the one that has opposite and adjacent. Make sense? So then here's the definition for tangent. Plug in what you have. So the angle measure, it does tell us, is 37. The opposite side, they labeled as x. And the adjacent side, they labeled as 23. All right, now we are going to solve for x. All right, what would be the opposite of dividing by 23?
Multiplying.
So I can multiply by 23 on the right side to cancel out that denominator. What I do on one side, I have to do to the other side. I have 23 times the tangent of 37 equals x. All right, there's no way to solve that by hand. You'll have to use the calculator, so just type that in. All right, and then if you entered it correctly, you would have had, oops, I think I'm looking at the wrong one, sorry. That's not what you would have had. If you entered it the right way, you should have had 17.33 units. All right, questions, comments? All right, we're so close to being done, but we've been going at it for about an hour, so I'll let you have 15 minutes. So be back at 9:46. 3. So bottom of page 8 in your notes. All right, just like before, in order to figure out what function we are using, you have to look at what you are given. So right now they have this corner over here labeled. They have this side labeled and this other side labeled. Looking from the perspective of the angle that they labeled, so looking from this perspective, we need to label these other sides. All right, so your options are opposite, adjacent, or hypotenuse. So what side is the side that's labeled 41? It's not adjacent. It is, because adjacent would be next to it, right? Like right next to the angle. So right now it is actually opposite or hypotenuse. Wrong. It is opposite. All right, because it's looking directly across. It's not touching it at all. So that would make it the opposite. All right. Also, I know like these two sides actually look the same, but you can tell that this side would be your hypotenuse because of that 90-degree angle, which would make the other one having to be opposite. All right. Down here, side GH, what is that side? Is it adjacent or hypotenuse? All right, well, we know it's not hypotenuse, because it's definitely not the longest side. It's also right next to that angle, so it is adjacent. All right. Since we are given the sides opposite and adjacent, that corresponds with the function for sine, cosine, or tangent. All right, which one is the only one? Oops, I put tan. I meant to put for our cheat sheet, right? So which one of those is the only one that has opposite and adjacent? Tangent. So we're going to plug everything into the tangent function. So opposite over adjacent. All right. It doesn't give us an angle measure for this angle that they have here, so it's going to stay as x. It does give us opposite, so opposite side it equals 41, and the adjacent side equals 12. All right, since we're finding an angle measure, what does that mean? What function am I going to use? Just the regular tangent function or the tan to the negative one?
And to the negative.
Good. All right, anytime you're solving for an angle measure, so angle measure unknown is what I'm trying to write. Then you're going to use the inverse function. And since we were using tangent, we're going to use the inverse of tangent. Tan to the negative one. All right, so in your calculator, you'll hit the second button and then you'll hit tan. You'll enter the fraction, just like how you see it. Hit enter, and that'll give you the answer. So blue button that says second, then you'll hit tan. All right, on your screen, you'll see the tan to the negative one. Put your fraction in and hit enter. All right, that gives us our x value as about 73.69 degrees. All right, so if you're getting something other than that, check if you put the inverse tan function, check that your calculator is in degrees. All right, but that's our missing angle measure. Questions? All right, you have a couple you try examples. So 5 of them. So do as many of those as you can. I think in about 5 minutes, I'll project the answer so that you have time to work on your practice in class. All right, so try the next 5 problems. In about 5 minutes, I'll project the answers. And you can move on to the worksheet. Calculator is in degrees. Problem 2. So real world situation, you should have noticed that it's asking you for the angle measure to solve for x degrees down here. It gives you the opposite and the adjacent side, which means you're using tangent. All right, but then since we have the angle measure that is missing, you have to use the inverse of that, so tangent to the negative 1. All right, so anytime you're solving for the angle measure, instead of the side length, do the inverse. All right, typing it in your calculator like that should have been about 49.4 degrees. If you have questions, feel free to ask as we go. Otherwise, I'm assuming that you're good. All right, I'm also gonna post these in the Google Classroom right as soon as we get started on the practice. All right, now scrolling down to page 10, so top of page 10. Practicing solving for the angle measure. Again, you are using the inverse function of tangent. So put the second button, then tangent, type in the number that they give you. It's about 72 degrees. All right, problem 4. You're setting it up, you're labeling your sides. Notice the hypotenuse side doesn't have any label on it, so that's why we're using tangent, because that one has the opposite and adjacent side labels. All right, plug it into your tangent rule. Solve for x. Since x is in the numerator, you can just solve it by multiplying the denominator on each side. All right, so by multiplying by 17 on each side, you get the x by itself. Type that into your calculator, and it's about 13.28. All right, questions on that? All right, last U-try problem, top of page 11. So again, look for what angle they gave you. Label the sides based on that angle. There's nothing for the hypotenuse, so that's why we're using tangent again, because we have the opposite and the adjacent side of the measurements. All right, when you plug it in, it looks like this down here. So since x is in the denominator, you do have to do a little bit extra work to isolate it. So if you multiply x on each side and move it to the left, it'll be easier to isolate. So in your calculator, you should have had 42 divided by tangent 55. And then that equals about 29.41. Questions, comments?